Black in Time Enterprises, celebrating who we are by honoring who we were.
They were regarded as the consummate invisible man. In fact, many porters were called George.
The lady got on the train in Chicago. Every time I'd serve her, she would call me George. George, bring me a scotch and soda.
George was a term that referred to George Pullman, who had begun the Pullman Company and hired the Pullman porters and what have you. And it was a term that was very much hated by the black workers, whether they were waiters or Pullman porters. They despised that term.
The club car is filled with dignitaries, multimillionaires. President of Universal Steel was one of them on the car at that time. And so she continued to call me George. I always served her. Now, I could not talk to her. I could not rebuff her in any way, but I could talk to Mr. Hale, and she got the message. I said, well, Mr. Hale, my name is not George. But even though we live in America, the best country in the world, where liberal education is available to everybody, yet there are still so many people who are so endowed with such dire traits of morbid scrupulosity that they allow ignorance to supersede intelligence. She got the message, paid her bill, and got out. And the whole club car went up in uproars, congratulating me for the delicate way I answered her question.
My father said, if you want somebody to call George, you better go make yourself a baby and name him George, so you'll have somebody to call George, because that's not my name. And he actually had to go before management about the incident. And it was after that the railroad began using name tags for the waiters and the porters to tell what their names really was, so that they wouldn't have to be referred to as George.
They just say, George, will you bring me or get me a glass of water or drink or something like that? But didn't cause no confusion, nothing like that. I didn't pay no attention.
And this gentleman sat on my station, and we waiters have a badge with our names on the badge. So he looked up at me and said, Jimmy, you look just like a nigger I met in Cincinnati. Are you that nigger? I said, no, sir, I'm not that nigger. How can I serve you? I always will remember he ordered steak. That was the most expensive meal on the B&O at that time. It cost $1.50. I said, I'll serve you. He said, you look like a nice nigger. He said, here, take $10. I said, no, sir, I won't take your $10. I'll wait on you, but I will not take your $10, because I will not allow you to buy my integrity for $10.
The Pullman porters recognized the extent to which they were being exploited, but those who complained would be fired.
A lot of men got fired fighting and trying to defend yourself. You can't defend yourself.
While there was interest in the need for a labor union, many of the Pullman porters were concerned to support this openly. They needed someone.
Some of the luggage porters are required to handle is heavy and cumbersome. When lifting heavy objects, use your leg muscles instead of your back muscles. Injuries not only reduce your earning capacity, but are painful as well.
This low salary, the long hours, the idea that if they broke any one of the hundreds of George Pullman's rules in his rule book, that they could be fired, this led them repeatedly to try to unionize, and George Pullman and his successor Robert Todd Lincoln repeatedly crushed them. The porters were so discouraged, they went to a man who had never been a Pullman porter and decided to hire him to run their union. This guy had a track record of abject failure. He had tried 4 times to organize unions, and each time he had failed. He was an avowed socialist. He was everything that you would think would guarantee failure. He was a man named A. Philip Randolph. He spent 12 long years battling to organize a union. He watched his top lieutenants be fired. They tried bribery, intimidation, and this guy, nobody quite understood how persistent he was and how much the Porters had faith in him.
Randolph was really having very little success until he got the ear of Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt really became enamored of Randolph. He thought very highly of him.
It was this oratorical skill he had, his ability to negotiate with organized labor.
Everybody knows about the famous March on Washington in 1963. That was a march where Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. What people may not know is that the original March on Washington was scheduled 22 years before, and it was organized by A. Philip Randolph, and Randolph called it off because Franklin Roosevelt agreed to pass the Fair Employment Practices Act.
Roosevelt backed him, and with that backing, he essentially forced the Pullman Company to capitulate and recognize the union.
12 long years to the day that he started his drive to organize a union, the Pullman Company came in, they shocked him, they shocked everybody around this long negotiating table by saying, "We give up, we will sign." And it was the first ever trade union for African Americans in America.
The Pullman Porter would have never been where he was, where he's at today with President Randolph. No way. Better hours, better benefits, and a place to stay when you're out on the road.
Although they were considered servants, I don't think that that's any accident that they were able to form a labor union, because they were exposed to so much. So they could think through that and become astute enough with some help to form a union.
Most everybody in America today, particularly given her recent death, knows the story of Rosa Parks and knows the story of the Montgomery bus boycott. Will remember that Montgomery was the place that most people think of as the kickoff to the civil rights movement in America. What people know is that she was arrested, and I think that's where they think the story ends. She was arrested and something magical happened. We got a boycott of the buses. It kicked off the civil rights movement. What they don't know is that the call that she made was to a guy, another name that's been buried in history, Edgar D. Nixon, known as E.D. Nixon. Nixon ran the local office of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and of the NAACP, and Rosa Parks was his assistant, was his secretary in that office.
When he got word that Rosa Parks was had been arrested, then he organized all the churches to have a meeting, and he contacted Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King said that, well, he would call him back. And so Nixon told him, "I think you'll want to be at the meeting because it'll be at your church." Church ministers had been contacted to have their people at his church. So he was almost pushed into being the leader of the organization that started the movement.
Behind the scenes, throughout the long days of the civil rights movement, the Pullman Porters played several key roles the same way they did in Montgomery. They had had a long battle to take on the Pullman Company and start a union, and they shared the lessons they had learned in taking on one of the most powerful white companies in America. And maybe most importantly, when they had no money, which was most of the time in the early days of the civil rights movement, one of the few forces in the black community that could actually raise money and contribute it to their cause was the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters.
The Pullman's Porters stand out because no one can discuss American labor history without a discussion of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, without a discussion of the significance of A. Philip Randolph.
With the tragic death of Martin King when he was assassinated, it was A. Philip Randolph who went on carrying on this struggle for another 20 years. That was why he was given the role of chairman of the March on Washington, and yet we all know we have a holiday celebrating Martin Luther King today, and it's only the rare young student or older person in America who has any clue who A. Philip Randolph is.